good evening to all of you. I'm really glad that all of you could come today, this afternoon. The title for our presentation is an overview of the 2024 United Methodist General Conference. The 2024 United Methodist General Conference is going to be held in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's very rare that it's happening within our own state on April 23rd through May the 3rd. Just around 6 weeks or so away. And the purpose of this presentation this afternoon is to share information in order to make all of us more knowledgeable about what General Conference is, about what are some of the things that are going to be discussed at the General Conference meeting and how they'll be discussed. We're also going to go into a little background and history of some of those issues so that we kind of know how we've got to where we are. And also what might be and what might not be the possible impact of some of those decisions on our church and on our denomination. So y'all, I want to begin by talking a little bit about General Conference and what it is. For some of you, you know a lot of this stuff already. For others of you, especially if you're new to our connection, this might be new to you. But in understanding what General Conference is, I first want to begin by talking about the United Methodist connection. It's probably too small for you to make out, but United Methodists understand ourselves to be connected with each other all around the world. We don't regard ourselves as just a bunch of independent franchises or separate congregations on our own, but we view ourselves as part of each other, where we all mutually support each other at different levels of connection. There's much that we share. We share a focus on God's saving grace given to us through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. We believe that God's grace not only gives us forgiveness of our sins, but that it changes us by filling us with the love of God and neighbor that transforms us. United Methodists, as those who have experienced that life-changing love and power of God, also share in a common mission. We seek to follow the Great Commandment and to fulfill the Great Commission. We seek to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The point is that we view ourselves as intimately connected. And the way we're structured, I always think about that old children's song about the human body, the foot bone connected to the leg bone connected to the hip bone connected to the hip replacement, and now hear the word of the Lord. You know, it's that kind of thing. Well, in the same way, we're connected with other United Methodist churches here in our northern Piedmont district and our missional network. And then our district is connected with other districts in the Western North Carolina Annual Conference. That's our kind of region. And then our Western North Carolina Annual Conference is connected with other annual conferences in our Southeastern United States jurisdiction. And we're also connected with annual conferences all around the world under the umbrella of General Conference. And it's delegates from each annual conference who meet at General Conference as a worldwide representative body to make important decisions that affect the whole connection in some way. As a way of introducing what General Conference is, and in order to let you hear a voice other than mine, I thought we would begin by watching a short video about General Conference that very succinctly says this is what it is, this is how things are structured. And so I would invite you now to turn your attention to the video on the screen.
This is a quick overview of the General Conference and how it serves the United Methodist Church. Three main bodies govern the United Methodist Church: the General Conference, the Council of Bishops, and the Judicial Council. The General Conference is the body that sets official policy and speaks as the entire denomination. As the highest legislative body of the United Methodist Church, General Conference holds the power to revise the Book of Discipline and the Book of Resolutions, while also initiating amendments to the denomination's constitution. General Conference normally meets once every quadrennium, or every 4 years. The Council of Bishops may also call a special session to address a specific topic. Only 2 special sessions have been called since the United Methodist Church formed in 1968. Any congregation, conference, organization, or person may submit a petition to General Conference to change the Book of Discipline or the Book of Resolutions. Further petitions may also be introduced from the floor by delegates. Most legislation requires a simple majority vote to pass. Amendments to the denomination's constitution require a 2/3 vote of the General Conference, followed by a 2/3 aggregate vote of the lay and clergy members present and voting in the annual conferences. However, changes to Restrictive Rules 1 and 2 in the Constitution, which establish the doctrinal standards, require a 3/4 aggregate vote of the lay and clergy members present and voting in the annual conferences. General Conference also approves the budget allocating apportioned funds. Official documents such as the United Methodist Hymnal and the Book of Worship, and official teachings on subjects such as baptism and Holy Communion. Delegates are United Methodists from around the world elected by their annual, missionary, or provisional conference. The total number of delegates at General Conference must always fall between 600 and 1,000 people. The General Conference consists of an equal number of lay and clergy delegates. Conferences elect their delegates no more than 2 years prior to the next General Conference session. Lay members to annual conference elect lay delegates, and clergy members elect clergy delegates. The United Methodist Church has a concordant agreement with 4 autonomous Methodist churches to send a total of 10 voting delegates. The Book of Discipline contains the formula for determining how delegates are apportioned from each of the conferences. The Secretary of the General Conference determines the total number of delegates and applies that formula to determine how many will come from each conference to meet the total number required. Every conference is allowed to send at least 2 delegates to General Conference regardless of its size. 1 lay, 1 clergy. All delegates are eligible to vote on all legislation considered by the General Conference. Bishops preside during the General Conference session, but have neither voice nor vote. They do not address the conference unless given permission by General Conference. The Book of Discipline, the Book of Resolutions, and other official documents affected by General Conference are updated following the session to include newly adopted legislation. In most instances, legislation becomes effective on January 1st of the following year. Amendments to the Constitution become official only after they are ratified. The Judicial Council may be petitioned to review any resolution or legislation passed by General Conference to determine its constitutionality or legality, its meaning or effect. In summary, the General Conference sets the policies for the work of the Church. It also adopts the worldwide denominational budget. By doing these things, the General Conference seeks to strengthen the mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. To learn more, check out Chapter 4, Section 1 of the Book of Discipline, or visit resourceumc.org.
Let's just give you a big overview of what General Conference is and what happens there. And I want to say a few words just about the nature of the folks who are going to be at General Conference as a worldwide body. And so, Josh, we'll go ahead to the map of the world, the Methodists around the world. One of the important things I want you to understand about General Conference is that it's truly a worldwide body. The United Methodist Church now includes something like 12 to 13 million people all around the world. And that map there shows you some of the places where the United Methodist people are located. There are other denominational branches of Methodism, the Methodist tradition in other parts of the world, but the United Methodist Church is the largest branch on the Methodist tree. Now, this map even is a little bit outdated from 2017. And if it were updated, what it would show is how the church has grown fastest in places like Africa and the Philippines, in these overseas areas of the church. There are also an increasing number of United Methodists in Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia. The church has just been growing by leaps and bounds in those places. And what that growth means is that now almost 45% of the delegates to General Conference are from outside the United States. And that number is expected to rise as the years go on. So we're truly a worldwide church. This is a picture of some of the translators who help at the conference. There are 10 different languages that are translated and spoken. And so the conference feels a little bit like the United Nations, where you have to wear headsets in order to understand what different folks are saying. And that's important to understand, because that international dynamic shapes the voting on issues, including the issue that we're going to focus on a little bit later tonight. So one of the main responsibilities, as we heard, when General Conference meets every 4 years, is to consider changes to our United Methodist Book of Discipline. The United Methodist Book of Discipline is a book that lays out our core beliefs and also how we organize and structure ourselves from the local church level to the general church level. Among the parts of the Book of Discipline, if you want to look through it, are our Constitution, which lays out our structure. It includes our core theological doctrines called the Articles of Religion, which are basically fixed and cannot be changed. A section called the Social Principles, in which the church tries to think thoughtfully and theologically about what the gospel of Jesus has to say to societies and about social issues. And there are also then different sections of church law that lay out how churches and annual conferences are structured, and how general agencies are structured, and what the Council of Bishops can do, and what are the requirements for ordination, all of those kind of things that are intended to guide the larger church and just give us a guidebook of what it means to live as a United Methodist. And so what happens is every 4 years, any United Methodist member or church or other body can petition General Conference to make changes or alterations to specific parts of the Book of Discipline. So even one of you, as an individual United Methodist, sitting at home, reading your discipline late at night or early in the morning, you can think to yourself, I think we need to change this. And you could then submit that petition to General Conference, and it will be considered as a potential change. So for this year's General Conference, there are over 1,000 such petitions asking for a particular passage in the discipline to be changed or deleted or added to. There are 2 books I have at home of these petitions, and they're like little phone books. Now, what happens at General Conference is these petitions are considered in a 2-stage process. The first stage is the legislative committee phase. And in that phase, what happens is the delegates break into different subcommittees related to different sections in the Book of Discipline. And each committee then reviews all the petitions that are related to its section of the discipline. Like each committee has an area of responsibility, and it looks at all the petitions related to that paragraph or paragraphs. The photo, if you advance to the next slide, there's a photo in the lower right that's a group of a committee that has met together in a circle, and they're talking about petitions that have been presented. So each legislative committee then decides what to do with each of its petitions. So one thing it could do, it can decide just to say no to that petition altogether and just kind of toss it to one side. Or the committee can vote, say, this petition looks good to us, we support it, we're going to recommend it on to the bigger plenary conference body to be voted on. Or the committee could say, this petition has some good things about it and some bad things about it. We want to kind of work on it and revise it and amend it. And then after we've amended it and revised it, then we want to forward it on to the General Conference body for a vote. So that's the second part of the 2-stage process. The entire General Conference body, all 862 delegates, briefly debates and votes on each petition that has been forwarded by the different legislative committees. Basically, the whole body, with a bishop serving as the chairperson to guide the voting, decides whether it wants to make that suggested change to the discipline or not. So what happens? General Conference takes place over 10 days, and for about the first 5 days, the legislative committees do their work, and the last 5 days, the whole conference meets to discuss and vote on those petitions that the committees have forwarded up to it. The whole process is similar to how the U.S. Congress functions, right down to the use of Robert's Rules of Order to structure the discussion and the voting. Now, I want to be clear that more happens at General Conference than just working on sometimes boring legislation and changes to the discipline. In between that, there are a lot of uplifting and really moving times of worship. There are times of prayer. There are powerful testimonies and addresses of the way God is at work through the United Methodist Church throughout the world. The conference also received reports from different areas of emphasis and different agencies. It discusses and approves the overall budget for the general church over the next 4 years. And in between sessions, you get to meet and get to know other United Methodists from different parts of the globe. But for our purposes this evening, we're going to zero in on legislation, potential changes to the Book of Discipline, and specifically we're going to focus on potential changes related to the issue of same-sex marriage and the ordination of gay and lesbian persons. Now, before we get to that, I think it's important to share with you some background because a few of you had questions as to kind of how the United Methodist Church got to its current place on these questions. And I shared a version of this background history with some of you last year. I'm going to repeat a little of that information now in an abbreviated way for those who didn't hear that, but maybe this will be a good refresher, even if you've heard a little bit of this before. Prior to 1972, the Methodist and then United Methodist Book of Discipline included no references at all to homosexuality or same-sex marriage. There was just nothing in the book about it, maybe because it just wasn't an issue at that time. But in 1972, the General Conference added a section to the discipline called the Social Principles, which, as I said, were an attempt to address social issues from a thoughtful Christian perspective. Now, the social principles, even though they appear in the Book of Discipline, have never been considered a binding part of the church law, which everybody has to subscribe to and follow. They're instead meant to be a kind of non-binding teaching that just expresses the general sentiments of the General Conference and United Methodists around the world. But back in 1972, when the social principles were first included, in one part of the social principles, a statement was added which said this, and I'll kind of read it to you. It said, persons of homosexual orientation are persons of sacred worth. Further, we insist that all persons are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. We do not recommend marriage between two persons of the same sex. What happened has since that time is after 1972, over time, every 4 years, the General Conference has met, and each time the most contentious debates have surrounded this statement about homosexuality. And down through the years, that original position has become more nuanced in different ways, and the voting margins have become slimmer, but in most ways, the core of that official stance has remained unchanged. So I want to share with you now what the Book of Discipline and its social principles said about same-sex marriage as of 2016. And what I want you to notice is how this statement tries to say two things at the same time. First, that gay and lesbian persons are created in the image of God and should be loved by the church. And yet second, that sexual intimacy between two persons of the same sex is not consistent with Christian teaching. So we're going to put this up on the screen now, and I'm going to read it for you in case it's hard for you to see. It says, we affirm that all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. All persons need the ministry of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship that enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. The United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. We affirm that God's grace is available to all. We will seek to live together in Christian community, welcoming, forgiving, and loving one another as Christ has loved and accepted us. We implore families and churches not to reject or condemn lesbian and gay members and friends. We commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons. So that's the statement. And it's a little awkward because it sounds like it was written by a committee, because it was. And the language is a little old-fashioned because it was written some time ago. But I think there's several things you can notice about that statement. One thing to notice is that General Conference argued that it was the practice of homosexuality. It's the act of that kind of intimacy itself that was not condoned. It did not say that it's wrong to be a person of gay or lesbian or any other sexual orientation. The General Conference tried to make a distinction between identity and action. It claimed that it is not same-sex attraction itself, but the acting on those desires that is incompatible with Christian teaching. That there is something about that kind of sexual relationship that is contrary to God's goodwill for human beings and is not the intention for God's gift of sexuality. Now, that distinction in part reflected the stated wish of the General Conference body not to in any way condemn gay and lesbian persons themselves. And so after 1972, later General Conferences added the additional words that sandwiched the statement to make clear that those words should not be used to demean or harm gay or lesbian people, that those folks should be included in the church and not rejected, and their sacred worth before God should always be acknowledged. So you might sum up the current kind of official statement in the United Methodist Book of Discipline as wanting to do two things at the same time, as to say that same-sex romantic physical relationships are not God's will, and therefore not something the church can add its blessing to. And yet to make clear that we are called to love gay and lesbian people and not to treat them any differently than we would anyone else, including ourselves. Some people have referred to this approach as a hate the sin, love the sinner approach. I don't think that's quite right, because I don't think hate is the right word, and because at times there have been genuine hate directed towards gay and lesbian people from Christians. But I think it's meant more like the statement, teach about the sin, but accept, love, and help the person. So what happened is that as a clarifying expression of that position, and in response to specific situations within churches and annual conferences, over years, additional language was added to the Book of Discipline to set limitations regarding the marriage or ordination of gay and lesbian people. And these statements weren't just put in the non-binding social principle part, but they were put in the parts of the discipline that reflect church law and procedure, and that are binding, and which must thus be followed by churches and clergy. So the Book of Discipline now includes places that reads, self-avowed practicing homosexuals cannot become clergy. Homosexual unions cannot be conducted by our ministers or held in our churches. Church funds cannot be used to promote the acceptance of same-sex physical intimacy. Bishops and clergy can be charged within the church if they violate these prohibitions. So that has been the United Methodist Church's approach to these issues in some form since 1972. And yet nearly every general conference since then has struggled mightily with this question regarding what to teach regarding same-sex marriage and the ordination of gay or lesbian persons. And that struggle at general conference has also reflected a struggle among individuals, among families, and within congregations. What has happened over time is that the attitude of many Christians towards same-sex marriage and what it means to be gay or lesbian has changed. And in particular, there's been a growing body of people, especially in the United States church, who believe that the church's stated position in the Book of Discipline is mistaken. Now, we shared that perspective in our last presentation a couple weeks ago on the Bible and homosexuality. So we're not going to go into the reasons for that this evening. But if any of you missed that, and if you'd like to watch the video, if you email me, I'd be happy to send that presentation to you if you'd like to hear it. And so what has happened is that a committed and growing minority have been pushing the General Conference to consider removing or changing the language in the discipline, or at least allowing local churches and ministers and annual conferences the freedom to decide these issues, and the freedom, if they chose, to marry and ordain gay and lesbian persons. Other clergy and laity have been led to go further and have at times protested the church's stance in the discipline by disobeying some of these prohibitions. So one trend has been the growing openness to gay marriage and ordination within the American branch of the United Methodist Church. But there is another trend which has affected these conversations in the opposite direction, and that's been the growth of the United Methodist Church overseas, particularly in Africa. Now, I made reference to this earlier, but we pointed out as the church continues to grow and spread in those areas, more and more, a larger percentage of the voting delegates are from overseas. And as a general rule, United Methodists in places like Africa and the Philippines strongly support retaining the traditional understanding of marriage and the traditional approach to ministry with gay and lesbian persons. And so you see how these two competing dynamics are heading in opposite directions. And it's those two competing dynamics that have led to the kind of deadlock that the church finds itself in now. Now, some of those dynamics and developments came to a head around 2014 and 2015. I want to share a few of those things with you. We'll put them on the screen, but they may be a little small for you to see. There was a pastor in Virginia who refused to admit a gay man into church membership and was overruled by their bishop. There were peaceful but disruptive protest actions held at each general conference by those who were seeking greater inclusion. There were some individual clergy who came out as having gay or lesbian partners or being gay or lesbian, and some of these were still allowed to serve by their bishops. In 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage as a constitutional right in the United States. There were a few clergy who conducted same-sex marriage ceremonies, including 2 that happened in parts of North Carolina. And then in 2016, there was the election and consecration of a woman named Karen Oliveto as a bishop in the Western jurisdiction of the United States. The Western jurisdiction comprises the westernmost part of the United States. It's also the smallest of the conferences within the United Methodist Church. It's also the one that feels most strongly about these issues of inclusion. So when the General Church met in Portland, Oregon in 2016, there was much to discuss, and it was decided to take a different approach. Now, I was actually able to attend that general conference, and this is a younger and skinnier version of the person sitting before you. And it was a powerful experience. Please know we talked about a lot more than gay marriage and ordination. There was inspiring worship. I met some truly wonderful Methodist people all around the world who are doing beautiful things for God. But there was also a sense in 2016 that the conference was just in a stuck place. And so a petition was presented that asked for the Council of Bishops to create a body or a committee that could offer options for a way forward for the church to stop some of the rancor and the bitterness and the struggle that was taking place. And if necessary, even to call a special general conference that would focus just on this one issue. Now, there's a joke about how good Methodists are at forming committees. The one about how many does it take to change a light bulb, one to call the committee to order, and all the people that serve on the committee. But this really was something new. A commission was created called the Commission for a Way Forward. It was made up of 32 United Methodist leaders from around the world, very diverse in age, culture, location, and theological approach from all sides of the spectrum of these questions. And the commission spent 2 years praying and studying and talking together. Members of the commission came up with 3 plans or approaches that the church might consider taking, which came to be known as the One Church Plan, the Connectional Conferences Plan, and the Traditional Plan. And I won't go into great details about these because we could spend a long time on it. But of these 3 plans, the commission recommended the One Church Plan for consideration to the Special General Conference in 2019. The One Church Plan would essentially leave the decisions about these issues to each annual conference and each congregation and each minister, and would protect the kind of freedom of conscience of everybody on these issues, that people could follow their own conscience. Well, then the Special General Conference of 2019 met for 3 days in St. Louis, Missouri, and it considered all these issues, including the 3 plans. And after some very emotional debate, a majority of the delegates voted against the One Church Plan and voted to follow the Traditional Plan's approach instead. The Traditional Plan was essentially a kind of doubling down on the church's position that largely involved establishing some mandatory penalties that could be imposed on those who violated the discipline on these matters. Now, that conference also passed a disaffiliation provision that created a process for some churches to leave the UMC if they so wished because of these issues. We'll come back to that in a moment. So in response to the approval of the traditional plan, there was a lot of pain in the church. Nobody was really happy, even those who had supported the traditional plan itself. And I'll explain that in just a second. Those who had hoped for some change in the position of the church were heartbroken to see those hopes dashed, perhaps for the foreseeable future. Some of these folks left the church altogether. Many middle-of-the-road American United Methodists felt the traditional plan was too heavy-handed and legalistic for them, that there wasn't enough of a loving spirit behind it, and so they reacted against it. Some ministers in churches and even annual conferences announced that they would not abide by all of the plan's provisions and penalties because they felt they were too punitive. And even those who supported the plan were left frustrated because something like 60% to two-thirds of the American delegates had supported the one church plan instead. The traditional plan passed largely because of the solid, almost 90+% support of the delegates in the rest of the world. And that made the most convicted traditionalists feel like they were a minority in the American church. And even though the traditional plan had passed, there were some elements of it that were ruled as unconstitutional by the Judicial Council. And even for those parts that were retained, it was very difficult to get it enforced in certain areas. The reason for that is because all of our accountability mechanisms in the United Methodist Church are local. The accountability happens from fellow clergy and other churches in the area where you are. And the struggle is that if everybody in the area disagrees with the provision and decides to disobey it, there's no mechanism really in the United Methodist Church to force them to do something. That's the struggle. So with all that pain, at least some prominent members in the church on both sides of the debate felt there was no other choice other than to begin discussing a separation of the church into two branches, a kind of amicable divorce due to differences of conscience over same-sex marriage and ordination of gay and lesbian people. And so these prominent leaders met with a world-renowned mediator named Kenneth Feinberg, who actually negotiated the settlement for the families of the 9/11 victims and who offered to work with these leaders pro bono for free, just in the interest of promoting peacemaking. And they together produced a proposal that they called the Protocol for Grace and Reconciliation Through Separation that would essentially be an orderly process to create two branches of the church. Well, this protocol, or amicable divorce proposal, was going to be considered at the 2020 General Conference. But we know what happened then. The coronavirus pandemic hit. I think it was 2 months before General Conference was supposed to be held. And the conference had to be postponed, not just once, but twice, because of conditions all around the world. So during all this time, what happened was that some of the most convicted, strongest feeling leaders on the kind of traditionalist side had been waiting for the protocol to pass in the hopes that they would start a new Methodist denomination that would just leave and not discuss these issues anymore. But now they would have to wait until all the way in 2024 for the protocol to perhaps be passed, and there was no guarantee of that. And so these leaders decided to go ahead and to splinter off and just to go ahead and, without a formal process, just start a new traditional Methodist denomination that would keep the same stance on these issues, which they called the Global Methodist Church. Now, the way the leaders of this new denomination invited other congregations to join them was not through the protocol, but through the disaffiliation clause or process that I mentioned earlier and that had been approved in 2019. That clause offered a short-term process through which churches could choose to leave the denomination with the approval of first their council and then 2/3 of their church membership, along with the payment of a substantial financial requirement. Now, over the past year or so, maybe more like 18 months, about 30% of United Methodist churches in the United States have voted to separate from the UMC using the disaffiliation clause. Often that process of voting was a deeply painful one. There was a lot of misunderstanding, misinformation, and animosity. Churches that already had a strong position were able to leave, and vote with a pretty overwhelming majority. But churches where there was more of uncertainty and struggle within the congregation, some of them were ripped wide open. It's been a very difficult year in the United Methodist Church, a year of grieving and loss and struggle. Now, on the other hand, 70% of the United Methodist churches in the United States, the large majority, chose not to explore disaffiliation or to disaffiliate. Our own church's council became knowledgeable and learned about disaffiliation, but chose not to explore it further, but instead chose to continue to monitor events, including the outcomes of the 2024 General Conference. Now, I want to say a word about that decision, because I know there may be some of us here who were disappointed that the council did not choose to explore disaffiliation further last year. I believe the council made that choice not only out of loyalty to the United Methodist Church, but they made it in part because, based on the experiences of other churches, they were aware that when a congregation does not have a clearly overwhelming preference for one option over the other, that even just exploring disaffiliation often results in a tragic split of the church and a crippling of the mission of Christ, including the loss of church members, staff persons, and ministries. I myself am convinced that if our congregation had chosen to spend the last year focused on considering disaffiliation rather than focused on the mission of Christ, then we would have become consumed by it. Not only would many of the so many good things we're experiencing now not have happened, but we would have entered into a deeply divisive process that would only have ended up hurting the church and its mission. That exploration process would have divided the congregation into two competing camps. And then I believe ultimately it would have led to a vote that would have fallen short of the 2/3 majority needed for disaffiliation, which then would have led to even more bruised feelings all the way around. And if all of that had happened, as I believe it would have, then the mission of Christ would have been greatly hurt, and our sanctuary would be about half as full as it is today. It's okay if some of you see things differently, but I hope you can at least try to understand why our leaders were led to make the decisions that they made. So that leads us up to today in the 2024 General Conference. What kinds of things will be considered? What might happen, and what might it mean for our church? I know this is probably more why you're here. So there are two main proposals that this General Conference will consider that would have the biggest impact on these questions related to the ordination of gay and lesbian persons and the potential blessing of same-sex unions or marriages. The first would have a more immediate impact. The second would have more of a long-term impact. So the first proposal, there are a number of petitions that focus on simply the removal of any and all language in the Book of Discipline related to homosexuality. This proposal calls for the straightforward deletion of those sentences that we looked at about the practice of homosexuality being incompatible with Christian teaching, and the deletion of those sentences prohibiting same-sex unions and the ordination of gay and lesbian persons who are in a relationship. According to these proposals, those sentences would just be taken out, deleted, and not replaced by anything else. In the past, proposals like this deletion proposal have sometimes been referred to as the simple plan because they focus simply on removing rather than adding anything new or complicated. Basically, what such an approach would do with the discipline is to turn back the clock on these questions to 1972 and previously, to go back to the time when the discipline made no mention of homosexuality at all. So what might that mean, and what wouldn't it mean if one of these simple plan proposals to remove the language were approved by a majority of the voting delegates? Well, basically, the practical effect would be little different from that of the one church plan we talked about earlier, where each church, annual conference, and minister has the freedom to follow their own conscience. Deleting the language about homosexuality would basically mean that the larger church has just chosen not to make any definitive statement that would bind all United Methodists one way or another, in recognition that we are not of one mind on these issues as a general church. So deleting the sentences would mean that it would now be up to annual conferences and churches and ministers to decide how they would address these questions. Now, to understand what this might mean if it were approved, let me just say again, this proposal stops with the deletion of the sentences and does not propose adding any new requirements of annual conferences or churches or ministers regarding the acceptance of homosexuality. No annual conferences would be required to ordain gay or lesbian persons who are in a relationship. There would not be any language requiring churches to receive a gay and lesbian minister. There would not be any language requiring ministers to perform or churches to host same-sex wedding ceremonies. Such things would not be required. The silence of the discipline on these questions would mean that neither are they prohibited. Basically, they would not be explicitly approved, but neither would they be forbidden any longer. The point is, no requirements, no prohibitions. It would be up to each annual conference, church, and minister to decide. And that means there would be some annual conferences that would choose to ordain gay and lesbian folks and some who would not. There would be some churches who would choose to offer same-sex wedding ceremonies and some who would not. There would be some ministers who would choose to preside at such ceremonies and some who would not. The only change would be this, that up to now, the discipline has not allowed those who wish to do these things to act on those desires. If the language were to be removed, they would be able to do so without fear of punishment. Now let me say, no one knows whether such a removal or deletion proposal will receive enough votes to pass at General Conference. It appears to be a very close 50-50 coin flip type proposition, which could go one way or the other. In fact, 4 years ago at the special 2019 General Conference, the simple plan was an option that was considered but did not have enough votes to pass. However, the fact that some delegates have left the church through disaffiliation might change the voting math enough to allow such a proposal to delete the language to be passed, because only those who are still United Methodists can serve as delegates to General Conference. The point is, we don't know what the outcome will be until the vote is taken. So what would it mean for our congregation if such a removal or deletion proposal were approved? Well, it wouldn't mean much of anything immediately, and it may take a good while before it means anything. Let me explain what I mean. First, typically new legislation for the Book of Discipline, as we learned, typically does not take formal effect until January 1st of the following year. So we would likely be continuing to operate under the old Book of Discipline until January 2025. And at that point, assuming there was such a change, it would mean it would be up to us as a congregation how we proceed. Now, there would be no guidebook or clear process laid out for how we would make such decisions. And so we would have to figure out how to do that together. I imagine that we would begin a series of discussions about how our congregation and its leaders would approach these issues. I imagine that it would be our council that would offer guidance about how we would approach that discernment process and how we would make a decision. But I would hope that in doing so, we would allow as much input from the congregation as possible. And I hope the council, I believe they would want that as well. Now, some of you, if there were such a change in the discipline to remove the current language, would be happy about and encouraged by such a change. Others of you here, I know, would be very upset. So I'd like to take a moment to speak directly to some of you who have strong convictions around these issues and who have shared your fear of what such a change in the discipline might mean. First, some of you who hold these convictions have a concern that if this change happened, then immediately after the discipline were changed, our church would be required to host same-sex weddings. As we've said, that is not the case. I hope you can see, based on what we've talked about, that this decision would be up to our congregation and its leaders, and that we would not try to arrive at any decision related to that too hastily, but with much conversation and thought and prayer. With regard to our church and same-sex marriages, there is another fact I want to invite you to consider. And this one actually saddens me in a way you'll understand. Right now, very few young people, either of the gay or straight variety, are getting married in churches. This saddens me to report, and some of it's because of the after effects of the pandemic, but our church has only been hosting about 1 or 2 weddings a year. Most young people are opting instead for destination or venue or outdoor weddings. And again, that saddens me. This may have very little relevance on what we're talking about, but the point is that only even a small percentage of heterosexual people are coming to the church to be married right now. I do not believe, as a few of you have feared, that if General Conference changed the policy to allow such unions in some churches that wanted to do it, that there would be tons of people showing up at our door asking about it very quickly. The church, again, is not the same host venue for weddings that it used to be. And second, a few of you who have these convictions have mentioned your concerns about whether the conference would force our church to receive a gay or lesbian minister, even if that went against your conscience or what the church had wanted. Now, here's what I'd say to that concern. If our conference ordained gay and lesbian folks who are in a romantic relationship, the number of those ministers would be very small, likely small enough to count on one hand, at most 2 hands. And that's out of hundreds of ministers in our annual conference. And in sending those ministers to churches, the conference would only want to send them to places where they would be fully welcomed and received, places where they and the church could be successful. The conference would not want to send these ministers to churches that might be conflicted about their presence, both for the minister's sake and also for the church's sake. The conference cares about the well-being both of our church and about the well-being of its clergy. And it is not going to want to do something that will hurt both. All that's to say that if such a change were made, I think it's highly unlikely that our church would be appointed such a minister at any point in the next number of years, unless our church as a body decided to communicate that we were open to that. I had someone reassure me recently in conversation that their advocacy to see the discipline changed is based not on wanting to force anything on any church or minister. This person said they simply want to be granted the freedom to follow their own conscience before God without the larger church threatening them with punishment for doing what they have come to believe is right. What I'm trying to say is that if there is a change that results in removing the discipline's language about homosexuality, then I do not believe anything is going to be forced on our congregation. The result is that it will be largely up to us how we proceed around these questions. And even in determining how to proceed, it would be a good while before anything might even be possibly changed at our church. There is also the real possibility, as I mentioned, that such a proposal to delete the language would fall just short and the current language would be retained. That will leave this. Then basically after this general conference, we would be in basically the same place where we are now. That outcome may lead to a very different set of challenges because there are a large number of United Methodists in the American church who desperately want to see at least some change, including many of the church's young people and younger generations. Many of these folks believe that this is a justice issue and an issue of conscience. And so it's possible for them that if the language is not removed, some of these folks will either just decide to leave themselves, or they may decide again to ignore what the discipline says, which leads to another struggle with accountability and unity. So that's the first proposal to be aware of, the proposal to remove the language related to homosexuality. And that's what it would mean and wouldn't mean for our church if that passed. So I want to turn now to a second proposal that might affect some of these questions, but in a more indirect way than the first one we've just discussed. The second proposal involves a proposed restructure of the United Methodist Church into different regional bodies around the world under the umbrella of General Conference. Now here's some history might help. The United Methodist Church began as a very U.S.-centered church, which was made up of 5 jurisdictions corresponding to the geographical regions of the United States. And over time, this U.S.-centered church established missionary conferences overseas that were called central conferences. And so right now there are central conferences, 3 of them in Africa, 3 in Europe, and 1 in the Philippines. That's where all those worldwide Methodists are that I told you about. And as I mentioned earlier, over time, these central conferences have grown, and they're now nearly as large as the U.S. church that gave them birth. That means the UMC doesn't have one geographical center anymore, but it's truly worldwide. In fact, some have proposed that the next General Conference shouldn't be held in the U.S. at all, but instead, for the first time, it should be held in Africa, in the Congo, which is now a center of United Methodism. But while the face of the church and its composition have changed greatly, the old structure of the church has remained the same. We still have the same structure laid out in our Constitution that we had when we were a U.S.-centered church with small little missionary outposts overseas. Our structure is kind of out of date and behind the reality. And that has led to all kinds of problems. For instance, the Constitution allows these central conferences in other parts of the world the freedom to adapt the book of discipline for their own area, for what ministry looks like. But the U.S. church does not have the right to adapt the discipline for anything. And that means that each General Conference winds up focusing mostly on U.S. church concerns and issues. And so these overseas delegates, they come to this General Conference and they wind up talking about things that mostly affect the church in the United States. And they're rarely able to focus on the mission and ministry in their part of the world the way they need to. And so there's a sense that the structure of the church needs an update to acknowledge the new reality of this now complex worldwide church. A couple of years ago, some of these Central Conference delegates came together and drafted a proposal to regionalize the United Methodist Church, to move to a less top-down structure and to more regional autonomy and self-determination. And their work also has the support of an important church body called the Standing Committee for Central Conference Matters and another called the Connectional Table. And what happened is these groups came together with a proposal for a new structure under which the United Methodist Church would have 8 distinct regional conferences for the United States, for areas of Africa and Europe and the Philippines. Now, under this new proposal, each regional conference would have a lot more freedom to decide about how it goes about mission and ministry in its part of the world. They would still be under the larger umbrella of General Conference. Delegates from all these places would still gather every 4 years. And under the proposal that's there now, there would be certain core parts of the Book of Discipline, like our Constitution and our doctrines and our articles of religion and the social principles that could not be changed or adapted by regional conferences, but that could only be changed at General Conference. But under this proposal, General Conference would have less power to dictate everything the regional conferences do. The regional conferences would have more freedom, including, under the current proposal, on issues related to marriage and ordination. Now, the 2024 General Conference is going to seriously consider this regionalization proposal. But changing the basic structure of the United Methodist Church is complicated because it involves changing and amending the Constitution of the church, which is where our current structures and powers are laid out. So think of an analogy to the U.S. Constitution. Amending the U.S. Constitution to change the structure of the federal government is hard. don't know how many of you paid attention in civics, but I think it requires a 2/3 vote of the Congress, both houses, and then it has to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. So you have to clear a high bar, right, to amend the Constitution. And the same is true in the United Methodist Church. The restructure proposal would require changing the Constitution, and that means not just 2/3 of the delegates at General Conference have to vote for it, but then all of the annual conference delegates all around the world have to vote on it, and it has to get 2/3 of their support. In the past, there have been a couple proposed restructures that have failed because of this. It passed at General Conference, but then didn't get the 2/3 needed around the world. But this time it does seem like there is more momentum for this possibility, in part because the delegates from the central conferences themselves are leading this effort. Now, this proposed regionalization to the UMC might be important for the future of the church's structure, but it would also have an impact on these discussions and maybe votes around homosexuality. If a certain type of regionalization were approved that gave the United States Church more freedom to vote on these issues on its own, apart from the overseas delegates, it would be more likely to result in a change in the church's position regarding same-sex marriage and the ordination of gay and lesbian persons, whether a simple plan type proposal or something else. Now let me say, even if regionalization were approved, that process would take time. It would take at least 1.5 years for all the conferences to vote on all the amendments. And then the new regional conferences would have to be organized at a special general conference for that purpose in 2026. It would probably be a 2 years long process. But many people believe that if regionalization passed in the long term, that it might lead to a change in the U.S. church's position on issues related to homosexuality after 2026. Does all that make sense? I hope so. I know this is some deep, boring stuff sometimes, y'all, but thank you for staying with me. Now, there are going to be other issues discussed at General Conference. There are budget concerns to go over, especially the negative impact of all the disaffiliations. Those disaffiliations are going to result in deep cuts, huge reductions to the general church's budget. And so the conference is going to be faced with difficult decisions like whether to fund more missionaries or more scholarships to Africa University, or what not to cut. And that's going to be really hard. There are going to be some other petitions that will consider an extension of the time window and deadline to allow more churches, if they wish, to consider disaffiliation, to kind of reopen that possibility for churches, including churches overseas. Although it seems that the contentiousness and painful experience of disaffiliations over the last year seems to have led to a loss of momentum for those proposals because of how difficult it's been. There are also going to be some other potential revision to the languages of the social principles. But again, those are not binding. They would have more of a symbolic impact and less of an impact on our local church than the other proposals. If you're interested in these issues related to same-sex marriage and the ordination of gay and lesbian persons one way or the other, then the two biggest questions for you to follow would be whether the proposal to remove the language passes and whether the proposal for regionalization of the structure passes. And if you do want to follow those things, you can do that. There will be a live stream offered of the plenary proceedings that you can watch online. There will be a daily review called the Daily Christian Advocate posted on the conference website. You can already go there if you want to read deeper about these things. And if you want to follow developments as they occur, I recommend that you follow them through UM News. UM News will post daily updates on their website, and they have a newsletter you can sign up to. I want to say UM News is not propaganda. I have always found them to live up to their tagline of being fair, faithful, and trusted. My experience is they try to present both sides of the issue, to interview people with different opinions. What I wouldn't advise you to do is to follow the conference by reading people who have already left the United Methodist Church and who would come to it with their own agenda. They are obviously going to be interpreting and filtering everything that happens through their own lens. And they are not invested in the outcome in the same way we are. And I would invite you to not follow General Conference by reading or watching mainstream media. This General Conference is going to be in the local and national news. But most of the time when outside secular media reports on religious and church things like General Conference, they always focus on the conflict and they rarely understand what's actually happening. They often have little understanding of the internal dynamics or the nuances of the church structures involved. And so, for instance, if the removal of the language passes or if regionalization passes, they're going to take whatever the most extreme angle of that would be that would draw the most clicks. And they're going to focus on the protesters who are outside the conference one way or another. And so please, if you really want to follow what's going on from a deeply truthful perspective, do not read the New York Times or the Charlotte Observer. Do not get your news from your neighbor's Facebook post. Do not watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. Read News. Now, I also hope to write you with several updates from General Conference itself. Back in 2019, I was elected by my clergy colleagues in the annual conference as a clergy delegate to this General Conference. There are 20 delegates who will be representing the Western North Carolina Annual Conference, 10 of them clergy persons like me, and 10 of them laity. And so I'm one of the clergy that's been entrusted with this heavy responsibility that I feel very deeply. I will be there in Charlotte in the middle of all this as one of the 862 folks who will be serving first on a legislative committee and who will then have a vote at the General Conference plenary sessions. And so that means I ask you to pray for me, and it means I also welcome your thoughts. I will listen to what you have to say, and I will consider what you have said when it comes time to vote on the various proposals. And when I get back, I plan to offer a session in which I will try my best to give you an account of what happened and what it may likely mean. So I want to close now. Thank y'all for bearing with me through this. I acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty about all this and how things are going to play out. I have shared with you some thoughts and best guesses, but that is all they are. And to be honest, practically every General Conference I've ever been aware of, whatever everybody said beforehand was going to be the likely outcome was not the likely outcome. I'm not kidding you. Like this almost every time. And so it feels foolish to me sometimes to even try to predict. No one knows exactly what's going to come out of General Conference or exactly what impact it may have on our church. But God knows. None of it will be a surprise to God. And in thinking about General Conference, I like the fact that the theme verse from the conference comes from Psalm 46. You can see it up there if you read really closely. It's the verse that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Through those words, God reminds us, be still because I am God and you are not. And that's why you can be still. Many people, though, aren't familiar with the whole of Psalm 46 and what it's about. Psalm 46 is about living through a time of great uncertainty or change or danger. Even about living through a natural disaster or national turmoil or even through war. And yet the psalm is about trusting God in the midst of all that, trusting amid everything that seems uncertain or that might even be changing, that God is the solid ground upon which we stand, that God is our refuge and strength, and that God can carry us through the storm. So I'm going to put this on the screen, and I'm going to read Psalm 46 for you, just most of it. I'm going to leave out a few verses to make it shorter. Hear these words as the word of the Lord to us. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. Selah. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations, they are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. But he utters his voice, and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. And then these words, be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. We delegates have been asked to read different translations of Psalm 46 every day between now and General Conference. And it is a good reminder to us that God will be exalted whatever mess we human beings might make of the church or General Conference or anything. We don't have to be frantic or uncertain or anxious or worry too much about things beyond our control. We can be still and know who is God and be glad again that we are not. And in the meantime, we as a church will keep doing what we've been doing. We will do what over and over God's word calls us to do. So we will love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We will love one another. We will love our neighbors. And we will go on making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world.